Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the fifth of our live Q&As in our Royal Family series with Shinan Govani. Over the next 20 minutes or so, Shinan and I are going to be digging deep into the wonderful questions you submitted to us in response to his fifth session this week, where he took us through both the royal estates of the House of Windsor, and then the fascinating modern family tree of the House of Windsor, looking at some of the very interesting and consequential supporting actors who have had an important role in the family's 20th century and now 21st century history. So we received a lot of great questions this week, and we're very excited to dive into them this morning. So I'd like to ask you all to join me in giving your warmest welcome to our fearless leader, Shinan Govani. How are you, Shinan?
I'm good. Good to be here again. We're nearing the finishing line, our second last session, right?
We are indeed. Yes, yeah. The end is in sight. But we really, I think, covered a lot of ground this week, right? With some very
I think it was
interesting.
A fun one.
It was a fun one, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some fun detours along the way. And
some real estate form, right?
Absolutely, yes, right. Exactly. Who needs Home and Gardens TV when you've got Curious Minds with Shinan Govani?
That's right.
So we kick things off with a very fun question from our audience member, Ruth, who wanted to ask you, Shinan, if you could throw a gigantic weekend-long party in any of the royal estates that you discussed in this week's lecture, which one would you choose and why?
I have a pretty easy answer for that one. Yes, I would choose Balmoral. I think there's just something about the Scottish Highlands, the vistas, the mist, the sheer atmosphere. While I think that many of the other estates and palaces seem to be really working palaces, Balmoral in particular has always struck me as a place where the queen goes to cool her crown, and you really get a sense of the off-duty royals. Moreover, Princess Margaret threw her 25th birthday party there, so if it's good enough for her, it's good enough for me. I was thinking Sandringham or Norfolk, but Sandringham, as I mentioned in my lecture, is known to be very drafty, and I think Balmoral ultimately wins out. I mean, I would rather be in the Scottish Highlands versus Norfolk, all things considered.
Right. A more dramatic landscape. Yeah.
And just a footnote on this, we didn't really get into it in our lecture, but it has come to my attention that there are a lot of rumors swirling around Balmoral, specifically in that people say that when the Queen does pass, that Charles may give Balmoral to the Scottish nation as a museum or a historical site per se, and retain Birkhall, which is his own home, as his sort of main residence in Scotland, because not a lot of the other royals use Balmoral in the way the Queen does this today. So it would be a goodwill thing as well. Give it to the Scots and put it in trust, but eliminate the personal responsibility for the upkeep. So it's kind of good for Charles as well. It's kind of one of the open questions, many of the open questions about what will happen when the Queen dies, and where will the centers of power be?
Absolutely. A great choice, and one that I think actually sets the foundation nicely for a number of the other questions we're going to dive into this morning, including our next one from Stephen, who particularly enjoyed your survey of the estates of the House of Windsor this week. He said that we've heard a number of stories recently where Harry and Meghan and other members of the royal family were ridiculed in the press for making ostentatious refurbishments to royal estates on the public dime. Is this sort of scrutiny of public spending on royal estates a relatively recent phenomenon, or has it always existed?
Yeah, the short answer here again is that it's an echo of many different controversies that have flared up over the years, and goes towards one of the recurring themes of our series, and that so much of the British monarchy has depended on reading the mood of the public, and making sort of incremental changes where one's needed to be. So in terms of instances where this has arisen, specifically the issue of restorations and repairs, in our living memory, there was a big row that broke out in 1992 over demands that taxpayers should contribute to the repair of Windsor Castle after it was damaged in a big fire. And that was a pivotal moment because it was at that moment that the Queen actually volunteered to pay taxes on 2 of her 3 streams of funding. So that wasn't a significant shift. But I had a vague recollection of other instances of like this coming up. And so, of course, I turned to one of our friends of the series. I asked Carolyn Harris, the historian, to weigh in, and she had some interesting sort of scuttlebutt from the past. She said during the first 5 years of Queen Victoria's widowhood in the 1860s, she did not live at Buckingham Palace and was pretty much rarely seen. She did not appear in public. We touched on this a little bit in our session on Victoria. What followed was some great public discontent about the cost of the upkeep of Buckingham Palace, even though the Queen wasn't, living there. And a satirical sign was attached to the railing in 1864 that sort of shows the level of discontent. The sign read, "These premises to be let or sold in consequences of the late occupant's declining business," unquote. Caroline also tells us that, speaking of Buckingham Palace, there was outrage regarding George IV's extravagance, including extensive renovations to the palace in the 1820s. The architect, John Nash, did not properly calculate the amount required for building materials, and the cost spiraled out of control. And then she also reminds us that the Georgian monarchs were involved in quite a few expense scandals themselves. Now, again, I think it's important to just bring this up because the thing with royal stories and royal narratives in general, and I hope I've been able to make this point throughout my series, is that a lot of it is deja vu. A lot of it, if you dig enough, is a case of the old becoming the new. We tend to live so much in the hyper present. I mean, this goes for many things, that there's a kind of amnesia about it. And one of the thrills and fun of following the royals is that, yeah, it's kind of all happened before. And there are precedents for most of these things.
Absolutely. So some great historical tidbits there, courtesy of our old friend Carolyn.
Yes, not new for Harry and Meghan. Let's just put it that way. Yes.
Right. So now shifting gears a bit, Shinan, we got a lot of interesting questions looking at then the other theme you explored this week, which is the sort of the supporting cast in the House of Windsor, the junior members. Barbara Johnson wrote in to ask, in this week's lecture, you discussed how junior members of the royal family are encouraged to pursue a career. Besides the military, what are some examples of other suitable careers?
Suitable being the operative word, I guess. I mean, it's not unlike rich kids from privileged families in general. There do tend to be certain kinds of careers that these sorts gravitate towards. One of the interesting ones is the early career of Prince Edward, who is now a fully working royal, as we call them. But in his earlier years, he apprenticed for Andrew Lloyd Webber, was a theater apprentice, and worked on many different productions, and then had his own television production company called Ardent Productions. Now, they did a lot of different royal series and documentaries in particular, but inevitably, in the press, this sort of spurred various conflicts of interest. And at a certain point, Edward did stop doing that. And another interesting example is the one of Zara Tindall. We haven't really talked about her too much, but Zara is the daughter of Princess Anne, so the Queen's grandmother. Now, she is a distinguished equestrian. She actually represented Britain in the Olympics, which actually took after her own mother. Princess Anne also was an equestrian and went to the Olympics. And as a result of being an equestrian, Zara has also been a brand ambassador, I believe, for Rolex, and done sort of many of the things that come along with those sort of things. Princess Eugenie, Andrew and Fergie's daughter, is an interesting example. Currently, she works for the art gallery, very blue chip art gallery, House and Worth. So again, like children of privileged families, being a gallerina, so to speak, is not an unusual career choice. And looking up Eugenie, I also noticed that her new husband, Jack Brooksbank, they just got married. He actually works for as a European ambassador for Casamigos, the tequila brand co-owned by George Clooney, or actually was founded by George Clooney, was sold. So there's kind of an interesting connection to George Clooney there as well. I did also want to mention a historical precedent, because this is always interesting, sort of making that connection. There was a gentleman named the Marquis of Carisbrooke. He was the first cousin of King George V, who had a career in banking. And I bring him up because in his obituary, when he died, the Guardian did call him the first royal to take up in an ordinary commercial life. So it does go back. There was another royal princess, Lady Alexander Duff, born in 1891. She was the first child of Princess Louise. At the time, she was the fifth in line to the throne, but she actually became a nurse, which was very sort of surprising at the time. She wrote her own memoirs years later called A Nurse's Story, which discussed her unconventional upbringing, her life sort of in the royal fold, as well as in nursing. So again, there are precedents for all of these things.
And then just to follow up on the question of the sort of junior members of the royal family, we received a number of questions asking, in effect, do these junior members of the House of Windsor have perhaps a less tortured relationship with the crown than the inner family does? Do they get all the perks of royalty without this incessant harassment and scrutiny of the press?
Yeah, I almost compare it to those sort of actors, movie stars who are, character actors who are always working, who have a modicum of fame but are not prisoners of it. I think the peripheral members, yes, do get away with more. They get many of the perks. They get to go to some of the estates we talk about. And, they get to bask in some of the reflected glory, but they don't have the responsibilities and that sort of thing. I once heard a very interesting sort of observation about sort of, different levels of fame in general in New York City, which I think applies to this. This person was saying the best sort of fame to maintain is the kind where you're famous enough to always get a table at a restaurant with one phone call, or get a really good table at a restaurant, but not be famous enough that you're followed down the street. So it's that sort of balance. Some of the people we've talked about are not in the spotlight. However, having said that, I think it may have been easier for this ilk in decades past, when there wasn't social media, when everyone wasn't on display at some time. I think even a junior royal is one bad post, one bad click away from causing controversy for the more senior royals and bringing untoward attention. So it is, it can be a tricky thing all around. One of the young royals who seems to be on sort of the on increasingly on the radar, I think people should look out for, is Arthur Chatto. Now, many people might not recall that name, but he's Princess Margaret's grandson. So Sarah Chatto is the daughter of Princess Margaret. She had two sons. Arthur Chatto has become a bit of a sensation on Instagram because he has boyish good looks. He's posted a number of shirtless pics of late. He's very into adventure sports. He finished at Eton and is said to be going to Edinburgh College. So he's sort of been looked at by the tabloids. He's increasingly being sort of covered. He went to the Arctic and did some sports there. He is the 23rd in line, so he's there. But yeah, so a little tip there. He's one to maybe keep your eye out on.
Okay, a good tip indeed. Now,
this might bring us to the question about Margaret, right? Yeah,
absolutely, exactly. Yeah. So we're running out of time, but we were going to close here with a couple of great questions about someone who would definitely qualify as more in that A-list category of royal stars, Margaret. A number of folks ran in to ask essentially, does Margaret sometimes get a bad rap? Our audience member Karina wrote in to say that she thought she had read somewhere that Margaret did some very admirable work with AIDS patients in the final years of her life and did it mostly anonymously. Whereas when Diana did the same sort of work, she always showed up with a posse of photographers. Can you comment a bit on the distinction between Margaret's private life and her public image?
I mean, I think with Margaret, ultimately, we do see sort of a sad devolution of someone. Like you see that she did have a lot of life, a lot of spark, many interests. And as we've discussed in previous sessions, she did bring in the arts into the royal court in a way, because she was friends with a lot of sort of artists and actors and playwrights like Tennessee Williams and Picasso and that sort of thing. So she was a woman of the world, but she was also a creature of her time. And she wasn't educated per se. She didn't have an outlet for her passions. And, we do see a lot of sort of horrific stories about the way Margaret treated people and of her being a snob. It sort of covers the gamut ultimately. Margaret, went from being the belle of the ball to being a royal terror in some ways. Yes, she did a lot of charity work. I don't really get the sense, like, unlike Diana, who also did things, of course, she did many things where she brought the press along and played the press. Diana did many things in private herself. I think the distinction between the two is that you really get a sense, and people obviously responded to them. You saw this in the outpouring of the reaction to Diana's death, that there was an empathy gene in Diana, which you didn't really see with Margaret. I mean, there was always a reserve between Margaret and the public. And to many extents, she was just the victim of her time. there's an article, I think you pointed this out to me out recently. What is it, in the London Review of Books? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll send that, and I will actually, to the folks at home, I'll send you this essay in the London Review Books, and the email we'll send out on Monday. But essentially, it's an interesting essay on a new memoir by Lady Anne Glenn Connor, who was one of Margaret's closest confidants.
Yeah, we'll encourage people to read the whole thing for themselves. But I was struck by this one line from it, which we'll just end on, in terms of sort of describing the psychology of Margaret. Margaret, she was cast as the id of the Windsors, beside her twinkling mother and impeccably dutiful sister. Margaret moved with the fast set, drank, smoked, and sometimes looked bored at official events. By the end of the 1960s, she was lampooned as Monty Python's pantomime Princess Margaret, lurching around in the world wielding a shotgun. Over time, as she divorced Tony Snowden, took up with Roddy Littlin, drank more, smoked even more, put on weight, she became a figure of camp fun, a caricature that took on a life of its own after her death in 2002. And that's the quote. And I think the salient point to end on is, that she played into that camp figure, but also the camp figure that we know her as took on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I'll just add as well, unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it, but there were a couple of questions on Mystique, that island getaway.
We can touch on that in the next session. It sort of fits in with
absolutely. And you'll get a few more tidbits, a little more background on Mystique and how it became a destination for the House of Windsor to go vacationing.
Yeah, and we can talk about the other royal hotspots, vacations hotspots. Yeah,
absolutely. That'll be a great segue, in fact, into our final session this week, when you're taking us to look ahead at the future of the House of Windsor, and how it might play out in through the lives of William and Kate and Harry and Meghan. Can you give us a little preview, Shinan?
Yeah, we're basically going to look at the future. What does it mean for the brand, the Windsor brand, as we move on post Elizabeth? We have a really great guest lined up, Victoria Arbiter, a royal commentator for CNN and other broadcast networks, whose father was the media attaché to Queen Elizabeth. So has a very inside perspective. So she has some great thoughts. And we're also just doing sort of a sum up of many of the themes that have come up through the series. So I look forward to that, please.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really, I think, a great finale to the great historical journey you've taken us on over the last 6 weeks. I want to close for our folks at home with just a couple quick programming updates. Our 11:30 a.m. Live Q&A with Laura Carlson. If you haven't received that email already, it's been canceled due to a family emergency she's dealing with, but we will follow up with you over email, and also answer the good questions you submitted in our live Q&A next week. And then I also want to call your attention to the fact that next Thursday, June the 25th, we're unveiling a whole slate of new Hot Docs at Home offerings that we'll be rolling out over the summer, including our very first ever summer season of Curious Minds courses. So stay tuned for more next week on all these fun new offerings. In the meantime, it has been a real pleasure chatting with you as always, Shinan. Have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to connecting with you next week to discuss our grand finale.
You too, Will. Thank you.
All right, take care. Have a great weekend.